Okay, y'all, let's get started. Quick reminder about the exam. Final exam is on Tuesday, December 12th at 10:15 a.m. In here, even though it's a 2-hour exam, you're only going to get an hour and 15 minutes for it. The reason is because it's just like a midterm. It's only going to cover the scripting language part of the class. Well, it's not completely true. It will cover some of the PHP connections to your SQL database. So you need to know the lecture where we talked about PHP's connection to the SQL database. But it's not like I'm going to be asking you to do ER design on this final exam, or that I'm going to be asking you to form SQL queries, sophisticated ones. It's going to be about scripting languages. And therefore, it's going to be an hour, 15 minutes. Format's going to be similar to the midterms, so there's going to be plenty of multiple choice and multiple answer questions with a few more open-ended questions. There's certainly going to be a Perl programming problem on it. There's there could be a JavaScript or a PHP or a I shouldn't say or like they're mutually exclusive. You should be prepared to write short Perl, PHP, and JavaScript programs for the final. But I would concentrate on Perl. And I'm going to give you for the final a one-page cheat sheet front and back that you can use, because you will need some help probably with the Perl. I'd focus on putting Perl commands on it and JavaScript commands. Okay, so actually I'll commit to not giving you a PHP programming problem on the final. It'll be potentially JavaScript and Perl. And you certainly will have some regular expressions that you'll have to do on the final. You might have one or two essay questions that you might have to do. Adam. Run that by me. You're making your own.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, you get to make your own.
So yes.
Yes, you will get to see your cheat sheet before you come to the final. And you can, as much as you can cram onto that thing and see with the unaided eye. So if you can put it in 8-point font front and back and you can read it, that's fine. Okay. Questions about the exam? I'll have, oh yes. Yeah, I don't think I have the sample final up yet, but I will get that up shortly. Okay, so the other thing, I've been seeing some chatter on Piazza. It seems like some of your Tennessee Voice emails went to spam. So if you feel like you never got the link to Tennessee Voice, check your spam folder, because now at least 2 students have indicated that it went to spam. Actually, if I could get a quick show of hands, how many have verified that their Tennessee Voice has gone to spam? Abby? No one else, though? Because I just figured if a lot of them were going to Tennessee spam, I'd probably let them know, because that's something they'd probably want to correct. Okay. But reiterating, you get 30 points homework credit free if you do that Tennessee Voice thing and submit to the SAIS link your screenshot of your confirmation page. Okay. So today what I want to do, I wanted to talk a little bit about the answer to the last question on homework 9, the XML question. And then we're going to talk about input events and regular expressions in JavaScript. So what I wanted to talk about with the homework 9, so if you remember, the last problem had you doing an XML file that encoded exam questions. And in talking to the TAs, it sounded like there were two ways that y'all went about it. One which is the preferred XML way, and the other which is actually going to work, but you're going to get a few points deducted because it's not actually the right way to do it in XML. So the right way to do it is, just a second, see if I got the buffer here. So is to have a tag for each of the different question types, an explicit tag. So what I did was I grouped things that were similar to all questions and had common tags for that. And then there were parts that were specific to each question type. And so for each question type, I had a tag that specified then subtags that contained all the information for that particular subtag type. And that's the preferred way to do things in XML. The reason is that this is actually just a context-free grammar. Believe it or not, when you covered context-free grammars in 3.11 and 3.12, this is just a sugar-coated context-free grammar. And in general, when you do either a DDT or a schema in XML, that's all you're doing is you're doing a context-free grammar that then a parser can use. Basically, you're providing a context-free grammar for your language, for your XML document. And then a parser can take that context-free grammar and use it to parse any XML document that you provide and syntax check it. Okay? So this is the preferred way to do it, where you have, remember, semi-structured data is where XML is good, but for it, what you have to do then with this semi-structured data is each part of it has a tag. So the other way you could have done this is you could have said, okay, there's a type field. And that type tag is going to determine whether it's multiple choice, essay, true, false. So now you're specifying the question type as markup content. It's going to be between the beginning and end of the type tag. So it's a part of the markup rather than being part of the tags. And that's not as good of a solution. And the reason it's not as good of a solution is you're turning this into what is called a context-sensitive grammar. So a context-sensitive grammar is one where it needs to know certain information that's embedded in the document. It needs to know some what we call semantic information. In this case, in order to somehow type check your document, it would have to know about this type field, that this type field contains information that allows you to interpret the rest of the document. So now you might have something like, say, question answer pair, so I'll call it QA pair, say plus, and it's going to be interpreted differently depending on whether this content here is matching or essay, in which case you'd lay it out differently. Okay? And in order for a parser to type check this document to ensure that the syntax is correct, it would have to know that the type field is important and also know the values of the type field and know how those values then correspond to type checking the rest of the document, and you can't provide any of that information in either a DDT or a XML schema, and therefore the only way you can't parse such an XML document with an XML schema or a DDT and hope to catch all errors. So if you did it this way where you had a type field, you're going to have a few points taken off because you've made it in a way that the XML document can't be type checked anymore by an XML schema interpreter or a DDT interpreter. You've turned your specification into what's called a context-sensitive grammar, where in this case the context is what is the type. Okay, it can't parse it independently of the information in the XML document. It actually needs information from the XML document in order to type check it, and that's no good. So you really, when you're designing XML schemas or DDTs, basically the meta specification for an XML document, when you have different subparts, each of those subparts should be given an explicit tag, is the bottom line. Okay, and I understand it takes a little bit of time to get used to XML, but that's an important part. Actually, I just had the insight about context-free and context-sensitive when the TAs told me what was going on. Okay, so again, what I effectively was having you do was a context-free grammar for this problem. It was just a sugar-coated way of doing it. Okay, so then moving on to today's topic. Yes?
I have a quick question before we move on. Did the hint section change?
Yes, the hint section,
Okay.
That was based also on what the TAs, the feedback I got from the TAs.
We did it the same as the original hint section.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay.
So I changed it already for next time because I realized based on my answers there was a clearer way to present it. So that was, I figured the homework assignment's done. It doesn't matter how I change the hint section, but based on feedback from the TAs, I changed it so that next time it's clear. So yeah, your eyes don't deceive you. I changed it so it was hopefully clear. Every semester I think the homework gets clearer because I get feedback about what wasn't so clear. And so this time there was a lot of questions about those pipe characters and how to interpret them. So, and there was also a lot of questions about PO boxes that I didn't realize. I've never put street addresses with PO boxes, but I was told by the TAs that in fact PO boxes can have street addresses, and then when I looked it up, it turned out indeed they can have street addresses, and I didn't want them to have street addresses. I was always under the impression that a PO box was at a post office, that there was one post office per zip code, and therefore specifying a PO box and a zip code was sufficient to disambiguate where a letter went. But apparently you can have multiple postal stations per zip code, something that I had been unaware of. So that falls under the you learn something new every day.
Another question.
Yes.
So if you put the bars between, like, instead of like you did in that list like that, you put them between, like, vertically, different things. Okay.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. It was, as long as it was understandable to the TAs. So the feedback I got was the way I had laid it out was confusing. So, and looking at my answers, I thought, oh, this was a way that was probably less confusing, so next time we will try it this way. But yeah, the vertical bars were fine because that's how I wanted you to do it actually this time. I just think I figured out a less confusing way to have it done next time. So, other questions? Okay, and I guarantee you on the final, I won't have you do an open-ended XML problem like that. You have to be able to read an XML specification or document, but I'm not going to make you write a free-form one like that. Okay. Now moving on to again, the input side. So Tuesday we talked about the output side, how you can use JavaScript to modify the HTML DOM, and by modifying the HTML DOM, that will automatically update the web page. But what we didn't talk a lot about was how the user can interact with that web page and how that interaction can then be translated to function calls to JavaScript functions that actually modify the HTML DOM. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I call this basically the input lecture, whereas Tuesday was essentially the output lecture. And you'll remember that one of the things that distinguishes JavaScript is that it's really not meant to take input from the console or from a file. It's meant to take actually its input from events. And similarly, output is generally not meant to go to a file or to the console in JavaScript. Instead, typically its output is really modifications to the HTML DOM, and then those modifications appear as a modified web page. So JavaScript really is about dealing with a graphical interface, the input coming from events, the output being a modified web page. And one of the primary ways you interact with JavaScript is through forms, which we've talked about previously in the course. But what we haven't talked about previously is, so previously we've talked about how in HTML you set up a form and how PHP deals with form data, but we haven't talked about how JavaScript deals with forms, what language mechanism Java provides for dealing with forms. So we are going to talk about the, first of all, language constructs that Java provides for dealing with forms, and forms are one of the big ways that the user interacts with a web page. So the big thing is that, in fact, form elements are treated as objects. They are in the HTML DOM, and just like all other parts of the page, form elements have tags, and those tags are laid out in a subtree. And there is a forms array. There's a forms property in a document, and that's an associative array. Every form has an entry in that associative array based on its name. So you can get, if I have a form named order, for example, I can get at that a pointer to the root of that form subtree by saying document.forms.order, or I could equivalently say document.forms order like that. Either way would give me a pointer to the subtree, the root of the subtree for that form. And it is true that a form can be referenced by numeric position, but that's a horrible idea. Can anyone tell me why it's a horrible idea? If you know that the form appears first on the web page, you could access it by saying forms 0. But that's really discouraged. Does anyone know why it's really discouraged to refer to a form by its numeric index?
Probably readability.
Readability is one, so it's a lot harder for someone who's maintaining your code to know what the 0th form is. But there's actually a second reason that's even more compelling. Yep, so if you put a form before it, now its index becomes 1 and the code's broken. And not only is the code for that one broken, but every other form after that one is broken too, because everyone's index has gone up by 1. That's why it's really discouraged to use indices, because it's so easy to break code. So Luke, your thing is 2, but that's more of a readability issue, whereas this will break the code. So the bottom line is I expect you to reference forms by their name, not by their numeric index. And if you happen to reference them by a numeric position, you will lose points on both the homework and on the final. Okay, then within a form, you can get access to the different widgets with their names. So element really is the form elements. You can think of elements, another word for that is widget. So the name attribute is going to give them their names, and you can get at those widgets with their names. And then the value property gives the value of the widget. JavaScript also knows that you're also often going to be dealing with a form, and you can certainly do something like, say, my form equals document.forms.order, and then refer to any element you want. Like if my form has an email text widget, you could refer to it as myform.email.value. But oftentimes when you are processing a form, you want to do it all in the same block of code. And for that purpose, for making it easy to group these related statements, JavaScript has a with statement. And that allows you to give, in effect, the prefix part of a path. And then it assumes that any name that you use within that with statement that is a property name for that object, in this case document.forms.order, then it will, you don't have to prefix it with the full thing. It's like this right here, this with statement resolves to a pointer. So that resolves to a pointer to order. So now you implicitly have a pointer comparable to this in a class that allows you to access the different form elements. And just like you don't have to explicitly use this pointer, you don't have any actual explicit pointer, but now I can simply, both of these email and name are form elements in order, and I simply can refer to them directly without having to say document.forms.order.email.value. And the advantage of the with statement over this statement is the with statement kind of tells someone reading your code that all of these statements are dealing with this one form. So it's kind of a nice documentation tool. It's good for code readability. So I encourage you to use the with statement when you are doing the processing with a particular form. And the scope should be clear. It's within, anything within the curly braces is within the scope of the with statement. So questions about that? Okay. So that takes care of basically how we get access to form elements. Now, we have access to form elements. That's navigation. So this first part was kind of about navigation. How do we get pointers? No, how do we get pointers to objects that we want to modify? Okay, and next we want to talk about how to modify properties. So I guess we're still a bit talking about the output side here, proper. And last time we were talking more about modifying properties in non-form objects. And now we're talking more about modifying properties in form objects. So that's the distinction between what we did on Tuesday and what we're doing today. But again, just like on Tuesday, the major player is the style object. So every form widget has a style object, and that's how you can control a lot of the properties. And Reasons we might want to change properties, a big one is to highlight errors in a form. Sometimes we can pre-fill out things in a form from an address book, for example, or sometimes when you're typing in, you get suggestions and from a drop-down menu, and then you just select the suggestion. It fills in the form for you. Or you may want to enable or disable form elements. Like when you're printing a document, you get, if I try to print this, you'll see that right now it says pages all, and that's bad that I can actually modify from and to. Actually, what you really should do is have from and to be disabled, and they only would become enabled if I hit the from, and then they'd be enabled and you could enter information into them. So you oftentimes want, or down here you can see these are disabled, although these are going to be permanently, I think, disabled because this document has no frames. Okay, so those are 3 reasons why you might want to change things. And we're not going to go through all of the attributes today, but the W3 Schools has a good reference for the style object where you can see all the different not all the different properties, but a lot of the common properties you might change. And I do have an example that I'm going to work through. So here we have a phone number that is correct. And if I do something to make it incorrect, well, let's just enter the, what? You learn something new every day. Not always what you want. Okay, so let's say I didn't enter the area code. I get a background color changed to yellow, the font increased in size, and it was turned to red. Okay? And you'll notice if I roll over here and let the mouse stay, I see what the phone number should be, which is always nice to have a way of telling a user what the appropriate format is for their data. So I will enter now 614, and it goes back to what it was before. If we take a look at the source code for that, you will see that here's the form down here. So it was named order, and we had the phone number was input type equals text, name was phone, the initial value 614-486-3153, and we had 2 events, an on-change event where we call a function called validate phone number, passing in this, which is a pointer to the selected object, and an on-focus event, which we call a method called select on the selected object. And if we go back and look at this thing, you'll notice that if I'm outside, it's not selected, but as soon as I select, it turns blue. That's what the select function is doing. We'll talk about focus in a moment, but focus is basically when an object is going to get all input events, it has the focus. But what we really care about right now is this change function. When I have entered a piece of text, it's going to validate it by calling this function validate phone number. And you can see I've created, first of all, a regular expression, and that regular expression looks just like Perl. So one thing you should know about JavaScript is that the regular expression syntax is identical to Perl. And this creates a regular expression object, which is then assigned to phone validator. So this is different than Perl. We're actually creating an object. And then we're calling the test method on that regular expression, passing in element.value. So that's going to be the text string that the user entered. The test function returns true or false. If the string that you submitted matches that regular expression in phone validator, then test returns true, otherwise it returns false. And you'll notice I was careful to put the caret at the beginning and the $sign at the end. If I had not done that, then I could enter extraneous information here as well as a valid phone number, and it would still have returned true, which is not what I want. Okay, so if the phone number is valid, then I want to make sure that if it was previously in an invalid state, that I return it to a valid state. And you see I'm doing that via the style object. I set the color to black, the background color to white, and the font size to smaller. You'll also see that I set an attribute called title to the empty string. The title is what I was using to convey the proper form for a phone number when the user rolled over the text box and hovered. Now, in practice, I should not set this back to the empty string. It's always a good idea if they hover over your text box to know what the format of the information should be. I was just doing it in this example so that I could have the title shown and so I could explain to you what title does. So if you set the title attribute for a widget, actually let's write it out. If you set the title attribute for a widget, then that text string appears when you hover over the widget with a mouse. Is displayed when the user hovers over the widget with the mouse. Okay, so then if the validation fails, that's where I want to put I want to change the appearance of that text box so the user knows something is wrong. So you can see that I set the color to red, I set the background color to yellow, I set the font size to 24, and I set the title to be, font number should be XXX-XXX-XXXX. And I really should not have 24 in here. What do you think I should have rather than 24? This is probably bigger. And you can see that if I go back here, and I'm going to reload the page. See, this is the original size of the font, right? Then I mess it up. Then I make it correct. That actually wasn't the original size. So that's why really it probably should be not 24, but it should say bigger here, because then smaller should reset it to the right size. If I remember to change that after class, I will. So questions about this. This is a pretty simple example, but it shows how you can modify the style object and the title. So the title could also be something that, if they hovered over the object, might be changed to an error message. You might actually make it context specific based on how they entered the number. Yes?
So with that smaller function, if you validate and it's correct once in a row, will it keep getting smaller?
Yep. Oh, I see what you're saying. Let's try that. That's a good question. No, it does not. So it's a one-time thing. Yep, it's just saying take it down to another value. I would have to look up, this example is several years old, so I'd have to go back and look up exactly what the semantics of smaller is. I think though that usually they don't like you to go with absolute sizes for fonts because they like, sometimes for example, a person will set a browser and ask for a bigger font. So then by saying bigger or smaller, the font is set off of the user's baseline. Whereas if you hard code those values, then you're ignoring the user's preferences. Okay? I happen to know with my aging eyes, I actually do set my browser to have a higher font size. I find it annoying sometimes when websites come up and effectively override that and show me a very fine print. So generally, I believe you're supposed to use these constants like smaller and bigger rather than 24. I had another question. Nope, okay. Okay. So moving on. Then, so this was how you change properties, primarily via the style object, but also the title attribute allows you to give the user information about the right way to format their input and also can provide feedback about what was wrong about the input they provided. Then we have events. So events are the way the user, affects the web page. And they occur for a variety of reasons. And HTML defines a set of events that every browser should recognize. So things like clicking a mouse, pressing a key, submitting a form are all considered events. And events are broadly characterized into two types. One is input events, which are low-level user interactions with input devices such as the mouse or the keyboard. And the second type are action events, which are often called synthesized events. And these are events that actually occur after an input event. So oftentimes, an input event will be handled by a widget, and the widget in turn synthesizes its own event. And often you are wanting to just respond to the synthesized or action event. So a good example is the onChange event that a text field or menu has when they are changed, and the onSubmit event that occurs when a form is submitted. And as I said last time, you can associate functions with these events. Each event is an attribute, and widgets have, for each event that they support, they have an attribute that starts with on, and then the name of the event. And if you attach a function or a piece of JavaScript code to that event, then when that event is triggered, the code is called. Okay, so you might have events because you want to validate input. For things that are rollovers, sometimes when you roll into a particular widget and then you want something to pop up, the title actually does that automatically, but sometimes you want some other thing to happen when you roll in. Just a second, Nick. So for example, when you roll in, you might want the button to be highlighted. I think I do that for my deal or no deal. When I am in, let's see, nope. There we go. It's hard to see, but when I roll into the deal, this is turning yellow right down here. Here you can see a gray border. And when I roll out of deal, you're going to see that that border goes back to being gray. So that's an example of using a rollover to improve the highlighting. And the title attribute doesn't help you with that. That's something where I had to change the color as I came in to make that happen. So that was done with a mouse over event. And you may sometimes see a warning when you leave a website. This happens to me. I'm a big hiker, and I often go to the national parks, and I need to make accommodations. And oftentimes when you leave a national park website to make an accommodation request, it will pop up an alert box saying that you're going to a lodging site run by a commercial vendor and that this is no longer a government-run website. So that's another reason why you might have an event. So here we have a list of the important events and some of my comments about them. So there is an onload event that occurs when a web page is loaded. So it occurs once, and you place it with the body tag. And when the web page is loaded, then the function associated with this web page will be invoked. And I believe that it's invoked after the web page is loaded and the DOM is created. So then you're modifying whatever has been created. And on unload, as you might expect, when you leave the web page. So this is the event that the Park Service is associating its alert box with. When the user switches to a new HTML page, this event is triggered and again is placed with the body tag. The onClick occurs when you release the mouse after pressing down on it over an object, and typically you use it with a button, a checkbox, or a radio button, and that is the synthesized version. So this onClick is an action event, and it is effectively the change event for a button, checkbox, or radio button. It tells you that they have been selected. Okay, you'll notice mouse down and mouse up. Those are input events, primitive, just like. And you rarely use them because generally you only care about a mouse click as opposed to the mouse down or mouse up. Yes. These two? Yes, so you would say when you have the body tag, then you would say onload equals and whatever your function is. Okay, and the body tag is what starts any HTML document. If you don't put the body tag in there, it's not an issue. The browser implicitly assumes it's there. But oftentimes you'll see the body tag explicitly there to mark the beginning of the HTML document. Okay, then mouse over and mouse out occur when the mouse cursor enters a widget and leaves it. So that's what I was using in deal or no deal. When the mouse enters the deal widget, that triggers the mouse over. When the cursor leaves, that triggers the mouse out. And you use these two on mouse out and on mouse over for rollovers. There's another one on mouse move, which you really aren't going to use with widgets. It's very costly because every time you move the mouse by 1 pixel, the event is reported. So it really is involving mouse tracking. And typically you don't want to do that kind of mouse tracking in a on a web page. You might want to do that in a drawing editor where you're drawing something. So for example, here, when I'm drawing, mouse move is really important. It wants to capture every pixel movement I make. But that's not what's going on, and you're typically not, you don't implement a drawing editor this way. There's HTML5 if you want to get into doing drawing editors, and that uses something called a canvas object, and it's completely different from just a more static web page, which we have here. So it's very rare that you use on mouse move. Okay, on focus is when the object gains the focus, and again, focus is when something gets the focus, it means that that widget receives all events of a certain type. Even if the mouse is no longer over it. That's the crucial thing, even if the mouse is no longer over it. Okay, so if I'm typing this URL here and I move the mouse away, which I'll often do, it's still getting the key events, even though the mouse is no longer over it. It's still getting keyboard events because it has the focus. Okay? Usually having the focus means that you are getting keyboard events, but sometimes you have to click a window in order for it to get mouse events. Okay, so for example, well, this now has it, but in order for this browser to get mouse focus, I have to click it. Now it will get all mouse events, but until I clicked on it, it didn't have the mouse focus. So that's an example where a window is now getting the focus for mouse events. So when a widget gains focus for some type of event, then that triggers the onFocus event, and you often want to do something like you might select all the text in the text box. Perhaps you might pop up something that gives instructions on how to fill out that text box. Usually it is associated with a text box. You normally don't care if a radio button gains the focus or a checkbox gains the focus. That's pretty unimportant, but a text box getting the focus is the time when you often do something like selecting the text in a text box. OnChange is a synthesized event for menus and text boxes. So if you change text, this won't get called as you change the text. It will only get called after the text box loses focus. So when you're done with that text box, only then does the OnChange event happen. So this isn't a way that you could check each character as it was entered. It's only at the very end. Same thing with the menu. It tells you that a menu item has been selected. Okay, onBlur tells you when an object has lost focus and you pretty much never use it. The reason you pretty much never use it is because OnChange will get called if a change has occurred. So OnChange effectively gets called when you lose focus. So you normally only care about a loss in focus because you're processing some change. Well, OnChange gives you that information. So you rarely will see someone put a function on onBlur because OnChange is going to be invoked as well, or triggered as well. Okay. Then there are the 3 for a key press, a key down, and a key up. A key press is like a click. So a key press is like a mouse click. It's the equivalent, the key equivalent. A key press is the key equivalent of a mouse click. It is a complete event in some sense. The on key press is what you have to use if you want to monitor the user as they make an incremental change to a text box. So for example, if you want to do those incremental searches whereas they enter part of a thing, like let's say I say UT and it's immediately popping up a list of things, as you can see, associated with UTK. So if you want to do that incremental suggestion, you have to do key press. You might be counting keystrokes. So if I'm entering a phone number like 865, after that usually a dash might automatically appear. Well, the only way you can put that dash in there is if you're counting key presses, and after 3 key presses you'll put a dash. After 3 more you'll put another dash. Okay? Or you might automatically skip to another text box. So sometimes when I'm filling out a social security number, it gives me 3 boxes for the social security number, and it automatically skips to the next box when I've entered the first 3 digits of my social security number. And again, it's basically counting key presses when it does that, and it knows when the maximum number has been reached, and then it skips to the next, it changes the focus to the next form element. Okay, all of those are examples of using key presses. Yes.
So if you're typing in a text box and you hit backspace and then the key again, will that count as yet another key press?
Yes. You have to keep track then of the fact that, yes, then you would actually have to check to see, there's a key code for backspace, and then you'd have to decrement actually the number of characters. So that is a bit of a complication. Okay. So just like you rarely used mouse down and mouse up, you rarely use key down and key up. You prefer instead the complete event. Then we have the submission of a form. So when a form is submitted, the onSubmit event gets triggered, and this normally goes with the form. So you've already seen that very early on in the PHP, where we had essentially 2 methods or 2 attributes. You had the method, which was the way it was sent over using get or post, and then we had onSubmit, which was the submit action. And I take it back, actually. That was something different. Let me distinguish. I need to distinguish between those 2. So let's go back to when we were talking about PHP HTML forms. Right there. That was action. So action is different from onSubmit. Action gives the URL that should be invoked on the back end. onSubmit gives the JavaScript on the front end an opportunity to process the form data and to decide whether the form data should be sent to the back end. If your code returns true, then the form data will be sent to the back end and that action URL will be called. If your submit function returns false, then that action will not be called. And one thing you're often doing with the submit is you're doing form validation to make sure that the user entered everything correctly and also that any required fields have been entered. Even if you validate as the user goes along, if they did not fill in a required field, that's something you can't catch until you handle the submit action. So onSubmit doesn't just validate, so right here, doesn't just validate, but can also ensure that all required fields have data. So again, if it returns false, you don't send the form, or you don't send the form data to the action. If you return true, it does get sent. So if we go back to my example earlier, and again look at this page source, you could find page source. Why am I not finding page source? Why? Oh, wrong. Yeah, I'm totally in the wrong place. Now we'll do it. There's page source. Okay. So you see here, I just said onSubmit equals return false because I didn't want it to ever go to a backend. In fact, you notice there's no action. So I never wanted this form data going anywhere. I just wanted it to eat it right here on the front end. Okay, on reset, same thing. If the user hits a reset, you can actually return false if you don't want the form reset. I don't know why you would override the user's preference in that case, but it does give you the option when the user hits reset that it triggers the reset event, and you can do whatever needs to be done. Typically, it's going to return the form to its default value, so it's rare that you'd actually do anything with the onReset. And then onSelect is a command that gets called when text is selected in a text field. So here, that's a text field. When I select it, that actually generated an onSelect event. And then you can do whatever you want. So just wipe it out. Okay, so when an event occurs, there's two pieces of information that become available to your code. One is a this pointer. So that's a pointer to the selected object. And that's typically passed as a parameter to the function. The second thing that becomes available is a variable called event, which can also be passed to the function. So these are predefined variables provided for you by JavaScript. These are the names you must use. And event is a pointer to an object that contains information about the event. Sadly, every single browser creates different properties for the event object, making it essentially useless. About the only thing they seem to agree on are mouse button, mouse coordinates. That's about the only things they agree on. So it comes down to basically having to look up the documentation for each browser and finding out for each event what they put in the object. It's really frustrating. But it is what it is. Okay, even it turns out the key press, your Firefox gives the information about the key that was pressed in a different field than the other browsers, which I'll show you in a moment. So about the only thing you can get out of the event object is mouse coordinates, and with some ingenuity you can get the key that was pressed out of it. That's about all you should ever count on it for. Okay, so now we have events, and we are able to respond to those events, and we want to change properties, and I told you vaguely how you do that through the style object, but there's also some other properties for each widget that you should know about. So for any widget, there are two general properties that are important. The disabled attribute will disable a widget when it's true and enable it when it is set to false. Okay, so for example, here I have a form where you can't really see it, but I can't click on email right now. If I try, it doesn't work. It only will be enabled once I have entered my first and last name. Once I do that, I can now enter my email address. But I couldn't do that before. And if we look at and also you can see this one had a submit action, and you can see it called foo.php with the various parameters. Okay, and if we look at the page source, now let's look at the page source. You can see that initially for email, disabled was true. And up here, and then for first name and last name, it called set email. And you can see I used the with function to get to the application. And then I check if both the first name and the last name, if they both have something in them, meaning their length is greater than 0. Obviously, I had another way to check that. I could have said if they're not equal to the empty string. Then I set mail.disabled to false, which actually enables it. Otherwise, I keep the email disabled. Okay, so that was an example of how you can selectively enable a widget. And then we've already talked about the title property. So there are also properties specific to each widget, and I'll go over them quickly. So for a text element, it can have a default value, which only really matters on reset and when you load the widget. Typically, you wouldn't touch this. But this one's interesting. You can actually make text boxes be read-only. So even if they're enabled, you still can't edit them. So sometimes you want to make text boxes read-only, even dynamically. And so you might set the read-only attribute to true. Now that's also available to you when you create the text box with the tag. So you can also set it preload. And the events that you typically, we've already gone through the events, but one that you often do handle with a text box is onSelect. You often call the select function, which I showed you already. It's called select. So you can basically say this dot select, and it selects the text. And it's a nice way of showing the user that the text box has focus. And also at that point, if they just hit the backspace button, the entire text is wiped out, which is often what they want. So often in response to the onSelect function, and in this case, you would just say onSelect equals, and you wouldn't write out a function. You just write that specific piece of JavaScript code. So you don't have to associate a JavaScript function with an event. You can just associate a piece of code with it. Now that said, actually, I should say that in the real world, what often happens is the functions are sitting in a file on the server, and they are imported in the head statement so that no one can look at your source code, because source code is valuable. And you normally don't want someone able to see it in the page source. So actually what happens in the real world is there is a way to import JavaScript files, just like you have in #include in C, you have import in Java. You have a similar thing that you can put in the head tag for an HTML page. It will import the Java file with all its function definitions, and then you would either in your statements set the events to those functions, or there's even a way with onload to do it. Sometimes people get really paranoid, and one of the purposes of the onload function is that then they associate functions with these events, and they'll actually have, so they'll have, what they'll do is onload equals, say, initialize. And in initialize, it will be things like with, say, forms document dot forms dot application say email dot on change equals, and that way a hacker can't even see which functions you're using in your page source. So you can really be minimalist in your page source if you really don't want hackers to know what's going on behind the scenes. So you'll often see that an onload that calls an initialize function, and the initialize function actually sets a lot of the properties for the form objects and associates functions with events. Okay. Then something for your homework assignment, 10, that will get you otherwise. I hate this about many browsers, but many browsers, when you're typing text into a text box and you hit return, you just want the return button to indicate that you've finished entering information in the text box. But most browsers take the return key as a submit event for the form and will prematurely submit the form, which you don't want. So you often need to, in text boxes, you'll see here, and you'll need it for the homework assignment, is check the key presses and intercept the return key so that if it's pressed, you don't actually end up submitting the form. And this is just kind of a generic function that I found online, because I'm not the only one who got pissed off by this. So this also shows you that Firefox differs from other browsers in how it treats where the key code can be found. So the ASCII key code for the return key is 13. And on Firefox, you find the key code in the which property, because it's so obvious that you would use which rather than key code like every other browser. Every other browser uses key code, so that's why you see the or here. So every other browser will return false or null for event.which, and then the second half gets handled. So this actually covers both Firefox and any other browser. It will get the key code. And then If the key code is 13, I call event.preventDefault. So that stops the default event from happening, which in most browsers, the default event is to submit the form. And instead, what I do is I call focus on my new focus object. So in this case, what I'm doing is I just have I'm shifting the focus to the next object that I want to have the focus after this text box, which is generally what you want to have happen. So this is actually a good generic piece of code to put in your toolbox, because I can't state it often enough because it will mess you up in the homework assignment. If the user hits the return button in a text box, it will prematurely submit your form. And you don't want that in general. Questions about this? Good. Okay. Most of these we've already gone over, so I'm really not too interested in radio buttons. One thing you have to be careful about with radio buttons. So radio buttons, when radio buttons are grouped by their name attribute, and the name attribute is what appears as an object. So if you have a form like this with 3 radio buttons for blue, red, yellow, blue, red, and yellow won't have individual objects associated with them because they all have the name color. Instead, there will be a property named color, and it will be an array that consists of the pointers to those 3 radio buttons. And then, so if you want to get at any of those radio buttons, you can do it, and actually then you'll have to probably get at them by the position attribute, or you could use the ID attribute if you wanted to uniquely distinguish them. And associate it with, so if you want to, the value property will be the value that is currently selected for the group. Length will give you the number of radio buttons. And one thing you need to be careful about, you can explicitly set the checked property, but you can't always be guaranteed that if you set it directly, that another radio button will be unchecked. Firefox has started doing that. I didn't check it in the other browsers. So in Firefox, if you set red to be checked, it will uncheck. So if I now set red to be checked, blue will become unchecked. But you can't guarantee that that happens. So in general, you use the click method if you want to select a different radio button. So if I wanted to select red, I would actually do something like whatever it is, document, I'm going to abbreviate now, document.forms.order.color, red is 1.click. And that will ensure in all browsers that red is checked and whatever was previously checked is unchecked. Okay, just give me a couple more minutes. For a menu, the important thing to know is that it has a property called options, which gives you the array of menu items. And if the menu allows multiple selections, that's the only way to figure out which menu items are selected are to iterate through that options array. And the reason is a menu has a selected index, but that only gives you the index of the first selected menu item, physically the first one. So, for example, if items 1 and 4 are selected, and 4 was selected first and 1 was selected second, the selected index will be 1. Similarly, if 1 was selected first and 4 was selected second, it will still be 1. It's always the smallest index that's been selected that is shown. So that's no good if it's a multiple selection menu. In that case, you'll have to iterate through the options array, ask each option object whether it's selected or not. And that's the selected attribute for each option item. The other thing that's annoying is on change for a menu doesn't give you the menu item that was selected or deselected. Really annoying. So in general, with a menu, if you care about which item was selected, you actually put your function with the onClick method for each option. Rather than putting a function with the onChange event for the menu, you put actually individual functions with each object. So that's annoying, but it is what it is. Okay, and that does it. Just so you know, there is also, the quiz today will cover regular expressions, so look at regular expressions before you take the quiz. I already showed you in an example what regular expressions look like, so you should be actually in pretty good shape for the quiz, and the page for regular expressions takes up literally that much space. It'll take 2 minutes of your time to look at before the quiz. So I will see you next Tuesday when we will be talking about Ajax.